hacking through the jungle, plunging into hidden tombs and crumbling temples, all in the pursuit of unimaginable riches. The Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, the secrets of the past. This is the life of the fictional explorers and adventurers popularized in movies and video games, with titles like The Mummy, King Solomon's Mines, Tomb Raiders, and of course, the world-famous Indiana Jones movies. But against this standard, how do real-life archaeologists measure up?
We all carry machetes and we have snake bite kits.
You might have a foot race with a sandstorm.
We had a bunch of gunfights here this year as people came in trying to kill me.
The adventures and the dangers all do exist. But here, there are no special effects, no stuntmen, no retakes, and no guarantee of a sequel.
There's a certain point when it's everyone for himself.
These are the everyday exploits, past and present, of real-life adventurers and archaeologists, those who some might call the real tomb hunters. Archaeology, the study of man's ancient past, is a surprisingly young science. Until the late 1800s, archaeology was little better than tomb robbing, a largely destructive practice, very much as it's portrayed in the movies.
Everybody's familiar with the first 10 minutes of Indiana Jones when he goes for that golden statue at the beginning. And, you know, he destroyed everything but that.
It was Egypt that first bore the brunt of these amateurs in the 1800s. Men like Howard Vyse, a British colonel who used gunpowder to clear the tombs, and Italian Giovanni Belzoni, a former circus strongman who used hydraulics to wrench gigantic statues of the pharaohs out of the sand.
Belzoni was not educated in archaeology. He was just trying quickly to discover things, going inside the tomb of Seti and taking the sarcophagus. Howard Vyse came and he opened shafts and the entrance of the pyramids with dynamite. We have to distinguish between real archaeologists and adventurers. All this were just adventurers like Indiana Jones.
Real archaeology, with its scientific precepts, would come to Egypt 100 years after Belzoni, in the form of a less destructive but equally determined Englishman named Howard Carter. It was Carter who would make archaeology a household word, and forever link it with the idea of unimaginable treasure. It was Carter's talent as an artist that brought him to Egypt in 1891, when he was just 17. Hired by a London exploration society to sketch hieroglyphics, the young Carter spent more than a decade exploring the pyramids of the pharaohs, sometimes sleeping at night in the bat-infested tombs he was immortalizing. In 1905, by chance, Carter met a rich traveler from London who would change his life. The Earl of Carnarvon, an avid collector of Egyptology, hired the now 33-year-old to oversee a series of treasure hunting excavations. It would become his life's work. For a decade, Carter helped amass one of the most valuable collections of Egyptian artifacts ever held in private hands. But that output slowed to a trickle when he became obsessed with searching for the tomb of a lost king, Tutankhamun, digging in isolated locations that yielded little but sand.
Carter was a real archaeologist. Carter was a patient man. He was excavating in the Valley of the Kings, trying to excavate systematically.
But by 1922, Lord Carnarvon had had enough.
Lord Carnarvon wanted to stop giving him money to excavate and told him, give me the last opportunity. This is the last season, and after that, I'm not going to take any money from you.
Carnarvon agreed to one last season. For Carter, now 44 years old, it was now or never. On November 4th, In the Valley of the Kings, the long shot paid off. Carter's men uncovered the first of 4 steps that would lead to an undisturbed royal tomb, and a treasure never before imagined. At its center, a solid gold sarcophagus weighing some 2,500 pounds.
Inside the tomb, there is about 5,000 artifacts has been found. And if you look at the golden mask, it's amazing. There is a beautiful statue show King Tut as a young boy coming out of the lotus. All of these are unique artifacts. If you go to the Cairo Museum, that has more than 150,000 artifacts, King Tut artifacts are the best.
A small portion of the treasure, some 50 pieces, would eventually tour the world. Its insurance value? A staggering $680 million. The scope and spectacle of the discovery created a furor, and the headlines only intensified when Lord Carnarvon died unexpectedly, just 5 months after witnessing the opening of the tomb. Carnarvon, only 57, was said to have died from pneumonia or an infected insect bite. But press speculation soon centered on a so-called curse of the pharaohs. But the first whispers of a curse had started on the day that the tomb was opened, circulated by Carter's workmen and centered on the archaeologist's pet canary.
Howard Carter came that season from England, and he had a canary bird in his hand. And the workman told him that this canary bird will give luck to us. Then maybe the tomb will be found. Then while he was digging, he found the entrance of the tomb. And he knew that this is a tomb that he was looking for more than 40 years. And he went back to his tent, and he found that the canary bird was killed by a snake.
The snake was a cobra, the same as the serpent depicted on the young king's death mask, a symbol of the goddess Wadjet, his protector. To the workmen, it was a disturbing omen. Carter himself was spared, living to the age of 65 and spending much of his remaining years completing a detailed inventory of the tomb's contents. But the stories of a curse refused to die. From that point on, in all popular fiction, tombs were depicted as a place of deadly hazards. The curse was a warning. Booby traps and other dangers awaited those who failed to heed it. But is there any truth behind these stories? Ask those who have dared to enter and met the danger head on.
Anyone who could stay 5 minutes inside this chamber could die.
An ancient, undisturbed tomb, the holy grail for any real-life archaeologist, and an essential part of every archaeological fiction. From the Mummy to Indiana Jones, the tomb is always at the center of the story. It's the ultimate prize, containing both treasure and mystery. Not to mention collapsing walls, hair-trigger blades, venomous snakes, and the occasional bottomless pit. But do places like this really exist? One possibility is the tomb of Xu Huangdi, China's first emperor, buried near Xi'an. Since 1974, 8,000 fantastic, life-size sculptures surrounding the tomb have been excavated. The tomb's central chamber is said to contain a treasure in gold, jade, and gems. But an ancient written account describes the hazards of disturbing it. Rumored to be protected by concealed tripwires, bronze-tipped arrows, and hidden pits, it has never been fully excavated. The costs and the dangers are too great. Such speculation aside, there is real evidence that the curses and booby traps that are so much a part of Hollywood lore do have a parallel in real life, as Zahi Hawass, Egypt's leading archaeologist, can attest.
They tried very hard to hide their tombs. Then they began to build maze corridors under the ground. They designed it like this to deceive the thieves. And the ancient Egyptians tried very hard to stop thieves of entering inside and steal the precious artifacts.
Hawass has personally opened more than 100 tombs, and more than once has found a nasty surprise waiting inside.
Archaeology is dangerous, in general. If you're going to be afraid of snakes or earthquakes or scorpions or anything like this, you'll never do anything. If you are actually a real archaeologist, you will never think about having a curse or died of an accident inside a tomb or anything.
The curse inscriptions he's encountered haven't deterred him.
If anyone will touch my tomb, will be eaten by the hippo, the lion, and the scorpion.
But he has learned to proceed with caution, ever since opening a long-hidden tomb in the Giza Plateau in the spring of 1993. Hawass had cleared the entrance and was just approaching the funeral goods, a row of ancient statues, when the earth literally moved.
There was about space like this. When I looked at this inside, I saw the eyes of a statue. In the same minute of that discovery happened, there was big earthquake.
Hawass was forced to evacuate the tomb, and his attempt to return was no more successful.
I actually went back next week to try to open the statues. And when I entered inside the tomb, I had a heart attack.
Hawass had 22 days in the hospital to ponder the question, was he the victim of the mummy's curse?
And I was laughing because I don't really believe in the curse of the pharaohs. You know, this happened by accident. I was working hard and I was a heavy smoker at that time. Then anything can happen like this.
Though Hawass discounts curses, he believes in taking precautions when opening a tomb.
I'm always careful in one thing. When I discover a tomb, I never enter right away until the bad air will go out and the fresh air will get in. And number two, I never shave when I'm excavating, because when you shave, things can open here, any germ can hit the person and can die.
In 1999, German microbiologist Gotthard Kramer confirmed that mummies can carry microscopic varieties of hazardous and even deadly mold spores. But these are inadvertent hazards. What about the booby traps made famous in the first Indiana Jones movie?
They did make traps to try to stop the thieves of entering inside. Then when the Egyptians in the Middle Kingdom built their pyramids, they made these maze corridors. They put in the corridors traps. It was like made of wood. When they enter between them, it catch their legs. Then they catch legs and hands, and then they stay there until they die. And when the first archaeologists entered inside these pyramids, they found many thieves, skeletons, hanging in their head and their legs.
Hawass knows only too well how those thieves felt. He experienced a booby trap firsthand in the spring of 2002 while excavating an area that's been called the Valley of the Golden Mummies near Bahariya in northern Egypt.
We discovered until now about 234 mummies. Most of them were covered with gold.
More tombs were discovered in the nearby town of El Bouiti, where houses had been built directly above them.
I went to the house of an old lady, and from the area near the bathroom, I went with a rope down for about 25 feet, and I found myself in a maze corridor of tombs, beautifully decorated.
The beauty of the underground tombs was tempered by the fact the modern town's sewage system occupied the same space.
It was very difficult for us to go through, and it was really a bad smell because of the sewage.
Just ahead lay a sealed tomb. Hawass suspected it belonged to the governor of the settlement, sure to be the richest find on the site. In his eagerness, Hawass disregarded his own rule about waiting to enter a closed tomb and was hit with a wave of toxic powder.
The powder, the yellow powder, was so strong and gives a very bad smell. and anyone who could stay 5 minutes inside this chamber could die.
The room had been filled with hematite, a substance that can be toxic if inhaled. Hawass remained only long enough to read the name on the sarcophagus. It was indeed the tomb of the governor he'd been seeking.
Did not care in that minute about the powder, about traps or anything, and I get in until I read the name of the governor. That is a moment that I can't explain at all to anyone. It's a moment of something like if a man is waiting to see his child that's born for the first time and he do not know how he looks like. That exactly could be the feeling when you go inside the shop.
Hematite is an ingredient in the paint used to decorate tombs. But why would the ancient Egyptians, who mined hematite and must have known its dangers, leave such a large amount in the chamber?
Do not really understand why the ancient Egyptian will leave about half a feet high of hematite around the sarcophagus. Maybe they left it to stop anyone entering inside the burial chamber.
The powder did delay the excavation, but Hawass suffered no long-term effects from his exposure.
Then maybe it seemed like the curse of the pharaohs: do not touch me, it touches others.
Ancient curses, booby traps, and poisonous gases. What other Hollywood-style hazards are waiting to put the bite on real-life archaeologists?
We have the highland snakes, we have the lowland snakes, we have rattlesnakes.
Scorpions and spiders and mosquitoes, malaria-bearing mosquitoes.
Fer de lance, that's the big thing here. And if one of those bites you, you're dead.
But once you get used to it, it's not that bad.
It's called ophidiophobia, from the Greek word ophid, meaning snake, and phobia, meaning fear. Ever since the first Indiana Jones movie, where the hero admitted his own ophidiophobia while at the bottom of a snake pit, these reptiles have become a staple of adventure movies and video games. But just how much of a real-life hazard are they? To Lisa Lucero, an archaeologist working at Yalbak, a Mayan excavation site near the Belize-Guatemala border, snakes are just one part of a generally perilous landscape.
Everyday hazards mostly include scorpions and spiders and mosquitoes, malaria-bearing mosquitoes, and bot flies, which carry a parasite, a bee worm, which can grow inside you, which you need to extract before it gets too large.
But for Mayan archaeologists, it is the snakes that, by their sheer numbers, pose the greatest danger.
When you're talking about dense forest with them all around, the odds of getting very close to one when it's just not paying attention or isn't aware of it and then does defensively strike at you is elevated.
That's a fact that American archaeologist Arthur Demarest can confirm. Demarest has spent the last 6 years excavating an isolated Mayan palace in the Guatemalan rainforest near Cancuén. The word Cancuén means nest of serpents in Quechua, the local Mayan dialect. It's a name that fits.
There's more snakes here than any place I've ever worked. We got everything. We're at the base of the highlands, but we're in the jungle here, and so we have the highland snakes, we have the lowland snakes, we have rattlesnakes.
The Cancuén camp can be reached only by helicopter or by an arduous 48-hour trip upriver and over sometimes impassable roads. Here, smoke pots burn day and night to ward off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes. But the camp's most deadly inhabitant is the fer de lance, known locally as the yellow jaw. A nocturnal pit viper related to the water moccasin, its venom is hemotoxic. It causes the victim's circulatory system to literally break down.
We have lots of fer de lance, that's the big thing here. And if one of those bites you, you're dead. We have the antivenom, but the amount of antivenom that it would take to keep you going from a big fer de lance bite would kill you.
these are very dangerous snakes in the Maya area, and they pack a very powerful venom. Their venom attacks the nerves and the blood. It thins the blood. You can often have internal bleeding.
As dangerous as these snakes can be, it's the isolation these archaeologists work in that's the real danger.
You're working in a very remote site. Even if you've got packs of anti-venom and so on immediately available, you still need to evacuate out as quickly as you can, and of course you're hours away from help. We were talking about probably 8 hours before the person would get out, and that's often not enough.
We've been very careful about it, mostly in terms of keeping trails very clear and relying heavily on the Maya to lead people around. They can spot the snakes. They just never have any trouble with them. The women that keep the trails clear walk around barefoot. And they say it's because we make too much noise. We bother the snakes.
We all carry machetes, and we have snake bite kits, and we're trying to be very aware of where we are. And you know, the pitfalls of working in the jungle, the hidden, you know, holes in the ground and vines sticking out.
But having antivenom is no guarantee of survival.
The anti-venom always says, you know, it must be stored at 25 degrees Fahrenheit or something. And yeah, right, where are you going to do that in the middle of the rainforest? Where are you going to be able to store anti-venom that's meant to be stored below freezing when it's getting well over 100 degrees every day in the heat of the summer?
If modern expeditions face such hazards, what was it like in the era before antivenom? The answer comes from the writings of Roy Chapman Andrews, an explorer for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. In the early 1920s, Andrews set the standard for high adventure, including its dress code.
Well, Roy Chapman Andrews was a very flamboyant explorer. He really looked the part, and he liked to dress the part and basically dress in the same uniform for a lot of the expedition shots and a lot of the publicity shots. He was sort of dashing with this very neat hat, and he carried a revolver by his side.
It was an image that Andrews, a small-town boy from Beloit, Wisconsin, worked hard to create. An avid reader and outdoorsman, he dreamed of exploring exotic lands, an unlikely prospect in the Midwest. In 1906, at the age of 22, he moved to New York and tried to get a job at the American Museum of Natural History, an institution known for its globe-trotting scientists. Andrews began working in the museum's zoological department, where he convinced his bosses that more exotic specimens were needed and that he should be the one to go and get them. Shanghai, Borneo, Korea, Japan, the Dutch East Indies. For a decade, beginning in 1910, Andrews would play the stereotypical great white hunter, bagging rare trophies from every corner of the world. By the 1920s, he'd become the museum's explorer in residence.
One could really see Roy Chapman Andrews as a sort of fitting real-life model for Indiana Jones. His adventures in these exotic places, his marksmanship, his penchant for adventure and risk. Lots of those qualities I see in the Indiana Jones characters.
And like his fictional counterpart, Andrews, though a naturalist and amateur zoologist, admitted to having an instinctive loathing of snakes. Nonetheless, he understood their mystique. To meet the popular conception of an explorer, he wrote, a man must have suffered cold, heat, starvation, fever, attacks from wild animals and savage natives, and must have been bitten by snakes. Snakes are essential. If you haven't had snakes, real ones, you just can't be a proper explorer. Andrews' chance to prove himself a proper explorer occurred in the fall of 1925, in the middle of the Gobi Desert, a place where the temperature can drop 20 to 60 degrees within minutes.
People may not realize, but the Gobi is a desert that's fairly far north. It's just south of basically Siberia. And the summer is a very short season. As September comes along, you already begin to feel those Siberian winds coming down from the north. One day you could be extremely hot in early September, and the next day it could be snowing.
It was in just such conditions that Andrews' expedition prepared for bed on that fateful night in 1925. Andrews was settling in when he suddenly spotted 3 brown pit vipers. Similar to the North American copperhead, the snakes are highly venomous. They also dislike the cold. The rapid drop in temperature drove them into the camp, seeking warmth in tents, bedding, clothing, and boots. Shouts rang out all over camp as the men reacted to a mass influx of vipers. One called out that his tent was full of snakes, hundreds of them. There was, Andrews wrote, no more sleep that night. In the course of what he later described as a very busy evening, some 47 vipers were killed. There were no human casualties, though Andrews' dog, Wolf, was bitten but recovered. Andrews had survived his real snake adventure. And as for the rest of the items on his list, cold, heat, starvation, fever, attacks from wild animals, and savage natives, the Gobi would provide all the adventure Andrews could handle, and more. It looked like something out of Lawrence of Arabia, or the first Indiana Jones movie. A line of camels laden with supplies and heavily armed riders. All around them stretched endless sand, the blazing sun, the biting desert wind. But this was the Gobi Desert, not the Sahara, and the globe-trotting hero was Roy Chapman Andrews. He was leading 25 scientists and staff on the first Central Asiatic expedition for the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
When you see these pictures from the Andrews expeditions, both the photographs and the video material, one thing that strikes you is how dramatic this whole thing is. It reminds you of an old silent film, like a D.W. Griffith film. The scale is so big, the number of extras are so great. 100 camels, this big desert, extremely dramatic. I can only imagine how shocked and awestruck a lot of the people that lived in these regions were when they saw this caravan careening down on them from the distance.
The year was 1922, and this time, Andrews was out to bag the biggest prize of his career, nothing less than the notorious missing link.
During the early 1900s, there was a lot of thought and theory about where the human race, where the human species evolved.
In a time before human remains had been found in Africa, several of the museum's leading scientists believed Asia was a likely origin point.
There was a book that was published actually by a museum curator that proposed a theory that humans, as well as other mammals, originated from Asia. Asia was sort of the wellspring for the human races, the human species.
Chapman focused on the Gobi, one of the most mysterious and unexplored spots on Earth, accessible only by a crude trading route known as the Silk Road.
It's about 500,000 square miles in area. That's the size of 5 Wyomings. It's very sparsely populated with a few little villages and nomads. This area, even today, is very poorly mapped. There's a lot of places still left to explore. One can only imagine in the 1920s what a blank on the map this desert was.
To fully explore an area of this size, Andrews would need more than camels. He came up with an unorthodox solution. Camels would carry supplies, gasoline, and oil, and stick to the Silk Road. Automobiles, the then new Dodge touring car, would do the exploring, using the camels as movable gas stations.
A lot of the Gobi is flat and is covered with a fine layer of pebbles. It makes for fairly easy driving, but you can be driving on the Gobi Desert for 2 hours just zooming along, and then suddenly hit an impossible place to drive.
Few vehicles can stand up to the extremes of the Gobi, as paleontologist Michael Novacek can attest. 60 years after the first Central Asiatic expeditions, the Mongolian government invited the American Museum of Natural History to complete the work Andrews started. Novacek, who spent the last 15 summers in the Gobi, has both followed in Andrews' footsteps and broken new ground, and a few SUVs.
We've gone through, gosh, I don't even know how many, dozens of vehicles over the years of the expedition. And they literally just fall apart. I remember finally abandoning a vehicle where we lifted the hood and the hood just blew off in the wind, and there was hardly anything working underneath the hood. And we said, well, that's it. One of the vehicles we abandoned, we actually saw the next year. We visited a nomadic family, and inside, the car seats made very nice couches inside of their gurs and their yurts.
Breakdowns were constant. Blown tires were recycled as camel shoes to give them more traction. But this unique combination of man, machine, and camel took Andrews' party into the most unexplored regions of the Gobi. Here, the expedition was at the mercy of the desert's extreme conditions. Daytime temperatures were so hot that the party's gasoline cans sometimes exploded, and at night, temperatures dropped to barely above freezing. Sandstorms blew in from out of nowhere, blistering everything in their path.
You have to react very quickly. If you're out prospecting in the field, you might have a foot race with a sandstorm to get to a sheltered place. This year, for example, we were hit by a sandstorm where we measured wind speeds of about 90 miles an hour.
Andrews wrote of tents lost in the wind, and sand so abrasive that it tore off his shirt, bloodied his back, and etched the windshields of the cars, until the glass had to be knocked out so the drivers could see.
You'll come back to a camp that's been hit by a sandstorm, and it'll just look like a hurricane struck it. You know, it's just a pile of rags and broken wood and stakes all over. And sometimes you'll find tents flying out over across the desert like balloons.
The desert harbored other dangers. There was crossfire from constant skirmishes between rival bands of Mongols and Chinese. Banditry was everywhere, though the heavily armed expedition usually found safety in numbers. But on one occasion, while making a supply run, Andrews became separated from the rest of the caravan. On the rise of the next hill, he suddenly spotted the glint of a rifle. Mongol bandits armed with rifles were moving toward him. Knowing that any attempt to turn the motor car would leave him exposed to their fire, Andrews drew his revolver, hit the gas pedal, and charged. As the car roared down the slope at 40 miles an hour, Andrews later wrote, the horses, unused to automobiles, began bucking and rearing with fright. The bandits, hanging on for dear life, couldn't reach their weapons. When last seen, Andrews wrote, they were breaking all speed records on the other side of the valley. Weeks, then months went by, with no sign of the human fossil remains Andrews was hunting. But then, in September of 1923, as the weather began to turn, the expedition stumbled across the find of a lifetime.
That whole experience was pure serendipity and accident. They were actually lost. They were wandering around on this flat plain north of a beautiful mountain range. The cameraman from the expedition got out of one of the Dodges and just started strolling around on this plain. And he walked over to the edge of this plain and looked down, and there were all these beautiful red cliffs. It's easy to miss these cliffs unless you know exactly, you have them plotted on a map, because if you're driving from the south, you can't see them. If you're driving from the north, you can only see them if you get over a ridge and look down the next valley.
It was this isolated and hidden spot, which Andrews would later name with typical flamboyancy, the Flaming Cliffs, that would yield the greatest fossil find of this century. It was not the missing link. No trace of ancient man was ever found in the Gobi, but it would change the face of paleontology forever. Hidden in the flaming cliffs were nests of what appeared to be huge fossil eggs. The expedition's chief scientist, paleontologist Walter Granger, made a controversial identification. The fossil eggs, he estimated, were 80 million years old.
These were actually the first nests of dinosaur eggs known to science. Before the expeditions to Central Asia, we didn't know anything really about dinosaur reproduction or what they did.
The discovery would revolutionize paleontology.
Huge fanfare, huge public interest, international press all over the world. Overnight, Roy Chapman Andrews, as well as the Central Asiatic expeditions, were famous.
Andrews would lead expeditions into Mongolia a total of 5 times during the 1920s. But the civil unrest and hostility to foreigners was growing. In 1926, as the expedition traveled outside Peking, a group of soldiers opened fire on their vehicles. It was the beginning of the end. Andrews was forced to cancel several planned expeditions, and by 1931, the Great Depression made such grand-scale expeditions impossible. After briefly assuming the directorship of the museum, Andrews retired to California to write his memoirs. He died in 1960, an adventurer in exile. The world Andrews had known had changed, and it was becoming a far more dangerous place.
Lots of people being threatened, people being shot. You realize how serious it is.
For the fictional hero pursuing the prize, there is always a rival. No matter how deserted the desert or how impenetrable the jungle, someone always shows up to give them a run for the money. Indiana Jones had the Nazis. Lara Croft takes on robots, monsters, even the mafia. But the fact behind the fiction is this: competition for artifacts between archaeologists and looters is very real, and sometimes it can turn deadly.
A woman almost being beaten to death in one case, lots of people being threatened, people being shot. You realize how serious it is.
Since the days of the pharaohs, robbers have raided tombs for gold, jade, ivory, and jewels. But in today's black market, a stone artifact can be just as precious. Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, has ranked artifacts as the 3rd largest illicit trade in the world, after drugs and weapons, and just ahead of money laundering. Even the hillsides of the Gobi, where Roy Chapman Andrews once prospected for fossils, have been pockmarked with crude pits left by looters. At auction, a dinosaur skeleton can bring millions.
When the looters come in and they grab something, they get some money for it, some idiot collector in the States, so that's where the real evil is, you know. People who think that it makes them sophisticated, that they have a chunk of somebody else's heritage in their living room. And they also don't know what happens down here.
In South and Central America, archaeologists like Arthur Demarest and Peter Matthews have come to terms that most of the archaeological sites they encounter have already been stripped of treasure.
More than 95% of sites have been looted, and the only ones that haven't been looted are the ones that are very well protected. The main tourist sites like Tikal, Palenque, Copan in Honduras, and so on. And even some looting goes on in those sites because they're so big and they have unprotected areas that even they can't be guarded completely. But the smaller sites that have no permanent guards at all, forget it. They're just wide open to looting.
Ironically, the few sites that are found undisturbed may be jeopardized just by the presence of archaeologists. Their activity alerts both organized gangs and the locals that there may be treasures to hunt. There are 2 kinds of looters: the opportunists and the organized.
Let's face it, money talks. And when you can make a relatively large amount of money, that's a great incentive to loot I mean, you can go into town and put the word out that you're looking for a jade item, and you will get several offers within the day.
Some looters are simply opportunists. A local farmer or villager who happens across an artifact and sells it to the next willing tourist they meet.
Many of these people are people I work with or in town or something, so I'm not going to turn them in. If I turned in every person who offered me something, I'd have a lot of enemies.
But there's another kind of looter who plays for higher stakes, working in gangs that are far more organized and far more dangerous. They thrive in regions where isolation, warfare, or other conflicts make patrol impossible. They use crews, tools, and four-wheel drive vehicles to remove artifacts weighing several tons.
What looters very often do with monuments is they thin them, as they call it. They take saws to them to get rid of a lot of the heavier stone that isn't carved and carry off the rest.
These looters travel in organized crews of 4 to 8 people.
You sometimes hear them in their camp. Don't know if they're drug dealers or looters. It doesn't really matter, because either of them will probably shoot you if they see you, so you just turn around and go back.
What the looters leave behind is often dangerous in its own right. At Nochtun, an isolated spot in northern Guatemala, as much time is spent repairing the damage looters have left as on actual excavations.
The biggest pyramid, actually, at Nochtun is so undermined with looters' trenches and tunnelling underneath that the entire structure is unstable.
Looters dig trenches into the foundations of the temples to find offerings that might have been left during construction. In the process, the building's supports can be severed. What's left is too dangerous for archaeologists to explore.
You can imagine when you've got a 30-metre high pyramid with a temple on top that's about to tumble down and 5 trenches sticking right into the sides of the pyramid. So often it kind of detracts hugely from the actual archaeological project, just in terms of taking resources away. And yet obviously it's our obligation to do this and to try and save the building from art collapse.
Most archaeologists never see the looters, only the evidence of the destruction they leave behind.
There's no point trying to confront these guys. You just avoid them if you can. And obviously report them to the authorities, and generally then the army or the police go in, but by then they've often gone.
Confrontations with looters are rare, but they do happen. In 2001, when a 1,000-year-old carving was stolen from the archaeological site near Canquen, the people working there decided enough was enough. Canquen is a rich archaeological site, but it's also an epicenter for illegal activity. Drug running makes it a major surveillance target for the Guatemalan Drug Enforcement Administration.
You'll hear the planes flying in the dark. DEA has 3 armor-plated night vision planes that drive them down and crash them. And sometimes they dump their stuff out of the windows before they crash.
Site archaeologist Arthur Demarest managed to stay out of the conflict until an intricately carved altar was stolen from the site's royal ball court. It was a theft that outraged the native Quechua Mayas, who had been working with Demarest for almost a decade.
The Quechua throughout the region understand that this is their parks, their sites, their economic future. You have these sites which can sustain, through tourism, the lives of thousands of people in the surrounding communities.
Demarest appealed to the locals for help, hoping their sense of outrage would overcome the healthy fear they had for the smugglers.
Looters take away, they're like the people who cut down the rainforest. You cut down the rainforest, you sell the wood, boom, you made some money, and it's over. And it's 400 years till it grows back. The looting is the same thing. It had to be stopped because it's destroying the heritage of these people. It's also destroying their economic future, because archaeological tourism is the economic future of this region.
Demarest's appeal worked. Tips came in as to the whereabouts of the stolen monument and the identity of the looters.
I had to bring in SIC agents, which is their FBI. It's the first time anybody's done what we did, which is to track down the looters at the source, raid the camps, arrest them, put them away. And so the reason why we were able to stop the looting and arrest these people is that we now have the entire population protecting these sites.
The raids resulted in retaliation against the Kechi tipsters and death threats against Demarest himself.
They've been trying to kill me, and so I have armed men. We've had about 3 shootouts this season. I have, friends in the region who have lent me some of their men of respect, hombres de confianza, as they say here, who are really good, well-trained, and I know under orders from their boss that if anything happens to me, they'll be killed, so they're very loyal.
The threats against Demarest and the other witnesses only increased after the gang members were arrested and a trial date was set for June of 2004.
I was the lead witness, but we had 8 Kekchi witnesses. Those people, unlike me, don't have bodyguards. They risk their lives. They're real heroes.
In a rare outcome for a region where arrests and prosecution of looters are almost unheard of, the thieves were found guilty.
The looters, each of them got 3 years. But 3 years in a Guatemalan prison is, well, 33 doesn't make any difference. It's, you've seen Midnight Express. They sort of model their prison system on that, I think. And so it's a pretty serious penalty, and it sent a powerful message.
Demarest works hard to ensure that the risks the locals took for Canquen are rewarded. Half the funds he's raised for the excavation go toward humanitarian efforts to aid the villagers who live around his site.
We have grants from a whole bunch of different agencies that have brought in capacitators, and train the people, helping them with sustainable agriculture and other improvements in their lives that will allow them to not only survive, but to thrive in the changes that will come, and to keep these sites theirs and these parks theirs, because they're sacred places to these people.
But it's a battle that could easily have ended in disaster for Demarest and his team. More than one archaeologist has learned the hard way that to anger the indigenous people is to court danger.
Were we going to get killed? Were we going to get held for ransom? Were we going to get held just for a period and then kicked out? We didn't know.
The setting, an uncharted jungle, dotted with lost temples and tombs. An explorer winds his way through the thick undergrowth, oblivious to the danger that lies just ahead. It could be a scene from a Hollywood movie. But the hero is not Harrison Ford or even Brendan Fraser. It's a Pennsylvania-born archaeologist with the unlikely name of Sylvanus Giswald Morley. The greatest living authority on Mayan archaeology, the 32-year-old Morley has just completed the first formal survey of the lost city of Washaktun, near the border of Belize. This is Morley's 4th major Mayan expedition. He and his men know the dangers of this territory, but they're close to their base camp, and their guard is down.
Coming back to what was then British Honduras from a very successful expedition in Guatemala. And almost within sight of the British-Honduras border, when everyone was thinking of a cold beer and a warm bed and this kind of thing, they were suddenly ambushed. Morley survived only because he had dropped his glasses. He dismounted to get them and clean them off, and thus he wasn't in his accustomed position. The expedition doctor took his place, And when firing started, the guide and the doctor were both killed.
The expedition had been mistaken for revolutionaries by the local Guatemalan soldiers. They scattered into the jungle and escaped with their lives, but the incident haunted Morley for the rest of his life.
It was the nature of dropping your classes, determining whether you live or die, that really bothered Morley for years. Took a real active will to go back into this environment where you never knew, literally, what might lurk behind the nearest tree.
It was a lesson Morley never forgot, and it's one that every archaeologist since has had to learn. No matter how well-intentioned, they are outsiders who may be seen as intruders or mistaken for enemies. For the rest of his career, Morley went out of his way to befriend the indigenous people he met in the jungles. A shared meal, a proffered gift, conversation over a friendly drink or two, or more. These were Morley's diplomatic tools. Morley had another advantage that kept him out of trouble. He was constantly on the move. Unlike traditional archaeologists, he did little formal excavation.
He had this incredible drive, this desire to do it. He was called a hummingbird by Indians who observed him because he was constantly buzzing around, and he lived on high all the time.
His goal was not to dig up treasure, but to map the locations of all the lost cities and hidden temples of the Maya. He cleared the jungle growth, but left the artifacts and stones themselves undisturbed. To do otherwise can be dangerous, a lesson that archaeologist Peter Matthews learned the hard way. His ordeal began in 1997 during an excavation in the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico, where a prize artifact had become the subject of a local power struggle.
We had found an altar that was in almost pristine condition, beautifully carved, still some paint surviving.
The locals living closest to the excavation site warned the archaeologists that the monument was going to be stolen. On the black market, such a piece could fetch as much as $1 million.
We'd buried this under a huge pile of stones and so on to try and protect it. And most of the stones had been pulled apart, and the villagers had put some of them back, but it was clear that people had got all the way down to the altar and determined it was there and might have been preparing to loot it.
Matthews and his team decided to transport the stone to Frontera Corozal, a large town about 25 miles upriver where they felt the monument would be safe. But their plan would never get off the ground.
We'd arranged for a helicopter to come in and pick up the monument, and we would go in, excavate it, crate it up carefully in a kind of wooden crate. At the same time, we knew this was a somewhat dangerous situation that we might be getting into.
As the team prepared to remove the artifact, they began to attract a restless crowd.
These people that were passing through were clearly not happy, and we knew they were going to relay these messages to surrounding communities.
Matthews and his team, which consisted of 3 Mexican archaeologists and 7 Chol Maya, immediately tried to pull out, but it was too late. By now, the crowd had grown to nearly 70.
I think probably half of them would have said, that's fine, get lost and don't ever come back. But at the more extreme end on the other side of the spectrum were ones who clearly had more nasty designs on the whole situation. And they basically held us hostage, kind of took all their money, took all their possessions.
As night fell, the archaeologists knew something worse was about to happen.
The big question was what was going to happen. Were we going to get killed? Were we going to get held for ransom? Were we going to get held just for a period and then kicked out? We didn't know. And that evening was a bit more ominous because just at nightfall, some men came in carrying guns.
the armed men told Matthews and the others to remove their boots, then at gunpoint forced them to run into the jungle.
So we raced, it was pitch black at this point. We were about 50 metres from the edge of the Usumacinta, which had a high bank. We moved very quickly down to the river, hoping that we could hide and get away before they changed their mind, because we knew that they were very likely to come after us again. And sure enough, we got down on the kind of beach at the edge of the river, and shots started ringing out all around us, and we could hear them pinging in the sand just at our feet and so on. And they were warning shots. I mean, they could have killed us if they wanted to, but they then told us all to stop and get it together in a group.
The next moments were the worst Matthews would ever experience.
I think probably the scariest part was actually when they lined us up on the edge of the riverbank, and I guess I remember thinking that the only reason really to do that was to shoot us and have our bodies kind of flop in the water, and we'd be found downstream. What goes through your mind at that point is it's everyone for himself, really. Just has to be, if they start shooting, do we all just stand there and wait to be shot in turn, or do we all take off and maybe one or two of us would get away? But that didn't happen because they didn't start shooting, thank God.
Instead, the armed men began to beat the excavation team with the butts of their rifles.
I got a rifle butt in the face and a broken nose, and the next thing I noticed was I'm on the ground, and I remember thinking, my God, it just knocked me clear off my feet.
Afterwards, the armed men withdrew back into the jungle. The excavation team was alone. But their attackers could return at any time. They decided to split up. 6 of the locals would head for the nearest town and try to get help. The rest would make for the Guatemalan border.
These other guys were Indians like the local communities and could probably slip down the paths relatively unnoticed, but we were going to stick out like sore thumbs. So we decided that we'd go across the river, try and get across the river and hide out on the Guatemalan side. And at this stage, it was the very end of the dry season, but it hadn't started raining at all, and so the river was very low and very calm, which was a factor in our getting out.
By chance, Matthews and his party found a makeshift boat and were able to make their escape. Crossing the river, they remained in hiding in the Guatemalan jungle for 2 more days, barefoot, bleeding, and without any supplies.
And I think all of us were getting weaker and so on. And so we were debating what to do.
Then came a welcome sight, a supply boat, bound for another archaeological dig downstream.
When the boat picked us up, we knew we were safe from the immediate problems. We were very lucky, really, with the way the timing of this all worked.
Overhead, there were already planes searching for them. The rest of their party had gotten through and raised the alarm. All 11 survived and eventually recovered. The altar that had become the subject of such contention was taken by their attackers to another village, but it did not end up on the black market.
It was set up in a little shrine in their community, and that's where it still is. It is an object of beauty and of value, and they didn't want it taken out of their community, which was certainly a valid point.
Matthews was lucky to be alive. In such isolated landscapes, even small conflicts like these can be deadly. But what happened